Right. Well, thanks guys for coming. I'm really excited for these papers. They look really great. So first we've got Kate and Heather presenting on work in Burkina. Go ahead.
Great. My name is Kate Merkel-Cantrell. I'm the Senior Evaluation Specialist at the Progress Group, who does a lot of evaluation work focused on land, resource management, land administration. We'll talk about today. Heather, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Heather Huntington. I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And we also have on our team two of our 10 research analysts who are doing this.
So we'll be presenting results today from this evaluation, impact and performance evaluation of the MCC project in Burkina Faso. We're going to go through kind of like the normal things. I'm going to take us through the background, interventions, and methods, and I'll hand this over to Heather for findings, recommendations, and then we'll have a discussion at the end. So Burkina Faso is a largely rural country. 80% of residents live in rural areas, with an economy heavily reliant on agricultural cultivation. And prior to land reform that we're going to discuss in 2009, the ownership structure of land was that all land was owned by the state, and there was no recognition of customary rights to land. So there was a recognition by MCC that upward trending conflicts, parallel land tenure systems, and growing population and associated migration were putting pressure on land systems, and they supported the new rural land policy and then the rural law in 2009. So this new rural land law in 2009 recognized customary tenure and authority systems. It created a new type of land documentation called the Rural Land Certificate of Possession in English. The French acronym is APFR, and that's what we're going to use today. That recognize customary rights to land. It can actually be individual or communal, and it's kind of similar to other MCC-supported documentation efforts in Francophone West Africa. Has this kind of like community approval dimension to it. Land reform also created some new land administration, decentralized land administration bodies, and that's the commune level rural land department and the village level land committee and land conflict resolution committees. So the way that the APFR works is that the applicant submits to their village land committee, and then that goes up to the rural land department. And after some verification, then there's a community consultation process for comment. Once the community has signed off on it, the registry signs off on it, and then eventually the commune mayor will sign the document. There's no standard cost to APFR. This is set at the commune level, and the process is supposed to take 95 days. So MCC's project, it's called the Rural Land Governance Project. I'm not quite sure why I didn't make it into this slide. The goal of the project overall was to increase investment in land and rural productivity through improved land tenure security and land management. It had a couple key assumptions. One is that they believe that this kind of new documentation, the APFR, would be viewed as a more secure form of tenure than informal or customary forms of tenure security. And they also assumed that there was a rising incidence of conflict that traditional authorities were unable to manage. There were three main intervention components within this project that the evaluation covers. The first had to do with supporting the government of Burkina Faso to implement land. So it mostly had to do with drafting the implementing regulations associated with the new land law, and then also some communications work about land reform and APFR and things like that, information dissemination. The second major component had to do with creating and then improving, building capacity of these new decentralized land bodies. So the rural land department offices, and we call those by the French acronym SFR, and then the village land committee and the village land conflict resolution committee. This third component had to do with improving land conflict resolution So both through the Conflict Resolution Committee and other work with courts, alternative dispute resolution. And then at the very end of the project, they chose to add a direct registration assistance component. So initially, this project assumed that simply creating and strengthening these new land administration bodies would kind of induce demand for the APFR certificates. But then they did decide to provide some direct registration assistance with a target of 6,000 APFRs issued by the end of the project. The theory of change associated with this project was that these interventions would lead to three important short-term outcomes. One, reducing land transaction costs by increasing access to these decentralized land institutions. Second, reducing the risk to realize investment returns by increasing tenure security, increasing confidence in the land governance system, and improving awareness of land rights. And three, improving the state's capacity to allocate, manage, and administer land. The hope was that this would lead to increased functioning of land markets, improved land use and land allocation. There were also land use components to the component 2 of the project, although I don't think we're going to talk about them much today. Increasing land and non-land investments and reducing land conflict with the ultimate goal of higher agricultural productivity and better livelihoods outcomes through income gains. There were 4 main evaluation questions. In this study, we're going to talk about 2 of them in detail today. So I put the 2 up here. The other 2 have to do with kind of like the legal reform aspect of the evaluation and also just kind of like a detailed accounting of whether the project went according to plan. So we did kind of like track and follow that. But we're going to talk today about what kind of improvements we saw on land administration outcomes, and then specifically the impact evaluation component, which looks at the project's impact on tenure security, land conflicts, investment, and a number of other outcomes. So this is a mixed methods impact and performance evaluation. I think in other sessions, we've talked about this kind of like MCC evaluation typology that it's a combined. So the impact evaluation component uses a difference in difference approach with a match comparison group. There are 47 treatment and 47 control communes. Then there are performance indicators and outcomes that are assessed through a mixed methods kind of like descriptive approach. Overall, there's 92 study communes. You can see them here. A couple important notes. We're going to talk about phase 1 and phase 2 communes. The project was implemented in 2 phases. So they started in 17 communes in phase 1. They kind of confirm that the approach was appropriate, and they attached kind of like specific milestones that the government of Burkina Faso needed to meet to expand the program to phase 2. They did do that with a couple of changes, and so they expanded it to another 30 communes after that. And then the other main note is that a key challenge to our data collection were the security concerns that were ongoing in 2021, 2022. So while there are 92 study communes, we were only able to revisit in person 50 of them at Nline due to security concerns, but we did collect some remote data at the commune level where possible for the ones that could not be visited. And so I think there's only 6 that we were able to not get any data at all. Here are the specifics of our Nline data sources. So the panel sources are highlighted in blue. So there's a household survey that had modules with at the household level, the parcel management level, and the field level. We did add a WISE module at Nline to get into more nuanced gender questions. And then the village survey was also a panel data source. We added at Nline commune surveys with the rural land department, focus group discussions, open-ended key informant interviews at the province and commune levels. And then we supplemented this primary data collection with a lot of secondary data. So that's satellite imagery and geospatial data, and a large land administration data collection effort. So we digitized about 1,500 APFR applications And we also collected application volume data in 40 offices. So that's kind of like visiting the office and asking about the number of applications received by different types, the number of certificates that were delivered, the number of certificates that were produced but not delivered, the number of application rejections, and also looking at the number of transfers. And then we also collected conflict data from the rural land department offices about conflicts that were referred up to them for resolution. And this is the empirical approach for the impact evaluation component, which is difference in difference with entropy balancing. And then we also tested for heterogeneous treatment effects across several subgroups, but we won't have time to talk about that today. This is just going to be the overall evaluation results, but those results are available in the report. And I'll hand it over to Heather.
Yeah. And I'll just go back to this slide really quickly. So we had a lot of data sources, and so this was like a very rich sort of qualitative and descriptive evaluation as well. And we also collected a lot of land administration data for those of you interested in the land administration side. Because we have a short presentation today, I will say we are just like hitting the highlights, and y'all might not even be interested in some of the highlights that we present. But just so you know, the report has a lot more information in it. So I wanted to just say that. We did intent to treat as the focus, and that's because, as we will discuss here, we had very few people who in our sample who actually ended up with the APFR document. So we weren't able to have enough of a sample to look at the treatment. So the other thing I will highlight before we talk through the summary findings, just to kind of set the tone, is that this was a, as Kate described, this was institutional strengthening, and it was sporadic registration, just not systematic registration. And we also had a quite long exposure period. So our exposure period from when the treatments rolled out to when the measures took place for end line was 9 to 11 years.
Yeah.
So like a 10-year. So this treatment happened and we go back 10 years. And I think, there were a couple things here for why this happened. Number one, I think, NCC wanted some more longer term exposure period studies, right? Because everyone says, oh, we didn't see anything 2 years after. Well, what if we go back longer? Then we might see something, right? I think that was, one of the justifications. The other issue was that this was a sporadic registration where there was an assumption that demand would be driven for uptake of these APFRs. And so you needed time for that to happen, right? You needed time to generate the demand for this to happen, things change slowly. So those are kind of the driving factors for having a 10-year exposure period and going back for such a long period for sporadic registration. So in terms of our findings summary, again, we looked at land administration issues, institutional development, and then we looked at a number of sort of household level impacts. The findings, I would say, are not sort of what MCC potentially hoped for. We have a mostly null set of findings, especially for household impacts. Probably not too shocking for some of you, if you you're learning, that's the evidence, body grows. We did find, evidence of change, especially on the institutional side, although it potentially, again, wasn't quite how I think thought it would progress. So working through these relatively quickly in the next 5 minutes. For institutional development and performance, this really focused on the sort of how the offices, the land offices at the commune level as well as the village level, how they were functioning, whether they were still operational at the time 10 years after. So what do we find? We find, interesting moment for evaluation, that the government and other donors, World Bank, had gone in and continued the program. So we essentially lost, if you will, the comparison group in terms of having areas with and without the village institutions. So this was kind of a good thing in terms of policy goals, but it was kind of a bad thing, if you will, in terms of like this. But that's what happened. So we really see that across the whole study area, we now have coverage of these local institutions. We did find, based on our data, that the ones that were established in phase 1 were doing better, if you will, the sort of first phase of institutions established, as Kate said, that had milestones attached to them in terms of performance requirements, were doing better, they were functioning better. because it's kind of important, finding to push on. And we did find that there's some evidence that sort of generally speaking, the MCC institutions were performing a bit better. Again, there's also a difference in the time lag for these things having been set up. And so there's a number of factors that can explain that, but we did find that they were actually better. Overall, the households were quite satisfied, if you will, with these local institutions, but these institutions have now, in many cases, become embedded with the customary system, right? So the customary authorities are serving on these institutions. You cannot differentiate the kind of statutory side from the customer. They're this hybrid thing now. So that makes it very difficult to answer some of the questions about formalization versus informal. For documentation, we have evidence of increased APFR uptake across the treatment communes. APFR transfers through the sort of formal land offices are also increasing, but the absolute numbers are quite small. Those transfers occur in the treatment communes where you have a bit of land speculation, which essentially equates to kind of peri-urban areas or urban areas where there's a lot of sales going on. In terms of the rural areas, we're not really seeing much of the uptake of the APFRs, even with 10 years. So this just kind of highlights the documentation levels, quite low. Does your household have documentation? And if you do have documentation, what kind of documentation do you have? So you can see that for the amount of APFRs are low. And there's no significant differences between the documentation status for the treatment versus control areas. Also important to note that unlike some of the assumptions that I think the project was kind of built on, the documents aren't really used for conflict resolution, and people tend to continue to rely on the informal documents that were provided by their customary authorities. So they're not actually using the APFRs in the way that the project thought that they would be used. Again, this is a bit different when you look at the peri-urban areas. But generally speaking, people really continue to rely on the original customary system. That being said, the qualitative data does show that people perceive the APFRs as useful for protecting land rights. So this is something that they see as something that could protect their land rights, but it is still too far removed for them in terms of costs and steps and complexity of actually getting these documents. So it's kind of like, of course, we'd like another document. Of course, we'd like this extra layer. But in terms of being able to get it or having motivation to get it beyond what they feel in terms of tenure security for the customary system, it's not really, the demand isn't there. So we looked at a number of tenure security indicators. We added a number of these at end line. And this again is just kind of a graph showing a lot of nullness, if you will. We did try to look at across a number of different sources of tenure insecurity, right? So instead of just having one indicator likelihood, or not likelihood of moving land, we tried to look at this. So we had panel indicators, and there were a lot of good indicators. We also had cross-sectional indicators. Didn't put those here, but basically we didn't find anything. We looked at this across subgroups, across phase 1 and phase 2, which is pretty good to find anything. This is just descriptively, I know I need to move on quickly here, but yeah, this is just to show you that, there's a lot of kind of descriptive statistics about where the sources of tenure security are. And again, you can kind of see between the comparing the treatment and controls at endline that we just don't see much of a difference. Okay, for land governance, again, I've already said this, but the primary decision makers are the customary leaders. And again, when there were a lot of questions about whether or not there were changes between reliance on customary versus shift to the formal authorities from the donor in terms of how land governance had changed or not. But it was sort of difficult or impossible to really separate that out when now the customary authorities are the institutions. land conflict was also quite low. So this was another assumption at baseline, for the project design, but the conflict dynamic, highlighting though that we could not go into the high conflict areas, as Kate mentioned. So for our sample, conflict was not a big driver. So we had pretty low conflicts. So our conflict indicators, there was not movement on those. When there is conflict, at the time of our study, most people took these to the customary land authorities for resolution and seemed quite happy and satisfied with the process for resolving those. So again, the kind of some of the assumptions that were built into the beginning of the project weren't there for, we did not see those at endline. This is just showing that conflict is pretty low, but we did see higher conflict that was in the urban areas, peri-urban areas, where you had some of the more like land market activity going on. And then the last set of findings that I'll talk through quickly are gender and women's empowerment. We did find that out of the certificates that were delivered during the study time that we looked at, those were delivered in treatment areas. So the project did do a good job of actually getting some of those certificates out to women. We have anecdotal stories of pushback on that. But essentially when we looked at whether or not there were changes, these were cross-sectional. We added these at endline, kind of some of our empowerment indicators. We didn't find too much evidence. We found some weak evidence that there's something there. And that's kind of what our team is trying to dig into a little bit now, some of the gender findings, because we think there's some more interesting stuff there. We will end with or close to end with saying that one of the things that came out in the study was that there's still a lot of lack of knowledge, uncertainty, not understanding about women's rights. This is especially important for whether or not people believe a woman can even be added to a PPFR. So in some cases, there was pushback on the idea that women could be included on these. And this is based on, I think, Kate, you can speak to this more, but gender was not a component for this program. So, there wasn't really a reason to believe that this would have changed because gender was not targeted. However, we did find kind of some evidence of negative externalities. So quick summary. The project did not lead to the demand for documentation as expected. Even with a long exposure period, we didn't see the expected impacts on demand or any sort of follow-on that would have happened. We did lose the kind of control group for the institutional, but in terms of lessons learned for studying sporadic registration, I think, this has implications for when you should do your data collection, do your impact evaluation potentially for those projects, and what indicators you can use with that. And then we, wanted to focus on for next phases of study, what happens with women's rights, what happens with the women's side of that. Okay, thank you.
Let's take questions for each paper, if that's okay, and that way we can keep this pressure in our minds. Questions?
Just on the I have a question and then a comment. On the question bit, so institutions have varied levels of functioning. So I was wondering if that heterogeneity is something that you all were able to understand, because an institution in one area perhaps will work very differently in another, and because you're doing a difference in difference, it may get that may sort of skew the results a little bit. So I was wondering if you had a baseline for institutional performance. Same with tenure security. So you saw that it didn't improve, but do we have a sense of what the baseline of tenure security is? And I'm so glad that you all teased that out, because I think that increasingly we're realizing that documentation perhaps has nothing to do with perceived tenure security. So it's great that you all brought that up. But I did wonder about the baseline for it, if you had a sense of what tenure security was like in the first place. So that was my question. The second was a comment. I think it's interesting that you all should go down the gender route. because in India too, research that we've done shows a gap between the de jure, which is all of these land title certificates, which is the agency you have. So you're giving women all of these titles, but it's debatable what they can really do with it, whether they have the power to transact, they know how to transact, so on and so forth. So I think that's a.
Yeah, I can start. So on the institution side, we have baseline information about what was happening before the establishment of the new land administration bodies, that those were established. So we don't have baseline information about that, we do have the baseline village information about what's happening. Generally, there is definitely capacity variation. One reason why the APFR cost varies is because they essentially have to use them to kind of self-fund their land administration offices. They don't receive a lot of national government support. So those that are located in areas where APFRs are actually demanded, usually this is because of land speculation, and so they're much better funded than ones where that's not happening. But generally, there's across the board a lot of capacity challenges in the county and land administration bodies. They have a terrible time retaining the qualified geospatial staff because they can make more money in the private market and things like that. And so I would say overall, there's capacity gaps everywhere. And like there's SFR agents who take other jobs, who are like not really kind of absentee agents in Maine or things like that. That's the first question. And then the second question was about. Yeah, you want to take that?
I would need to look at the statistics for, we have that in the report.
Okay.
It ranges depending on the indicator, but relatively speaking, it's higher than some areas of Africa, but it's not, I don't want to make, and I get my studies confused in my brain. But certainly, yeah, certainly there's tenure insecurity there. We didn't have at baseline, though, I think specific, we did have some of the sources, but I think, but I know we did add some additional targeted to like government.
Expropriation.
Exactly, yeah. So we have kind of more rich data from the cross-section timeline, but yeah, we do have that in here. I will say for the the variation in governance capacity, now that the report is done, we have a team working on digging into some of these issues of governance and gender and kind of all the interesting things that we couldn't really focus on when we were like impact evaluation. Yeah. So we're hoping this summer, I'm looking at Laura because she's one of our we are hoping to kind of some additional studies that get into these really interesting other things that we've done.
I was just gonna ask, is your interest or momentum to replicate what you did here somewhere else in Africa, just to see if there's any correlation between what you found here and what you might find there, whether it's in a French-speaking country or elsewhere?
Look at Daniel for that.
My question really was, because maybe it was in the first few slides before I came in, but the pickup is very low. So and it's 10 years, whether you expect other components of any impact in, from all the study or if you really certificate is the main thing, I don't know.
So to answer this question, I don't know. I think what to be blunt, I think because there's so many malls, I think this is probably something where people wouldn't want to replicate it, or at least the donors wouldn't want to fund this. That I mean, I'm just making this up. I'm speculating. I think that's it's sort of like okay, this checks the box. We did it. We see what we see, and then the question of whether or not folks would want to spend this much money to look at this in a different context. Yeah, I think there would be. I don't think that would. and again,
I think there is something similar in Benin.
Yeah.
It's
But I think it's the same issue,
the same issue.
the same problem, yeah.
So that's my thought on that.
I guess one of the messages that I'm getting, I guess it's, the defining words that documentation doesn't necessarily equate with intangible security, and that seems to be a basic supposition for a lot of the movements in land for right now. We need documentation because most people don't have intangible security, and documentation will provide them with that.
Well, to Daniel's point, people didn't actually get the documentation here. So in systematic studies, you do see some changes in the indicators. Now, do you see change on perceived intangible security in the documentation studies? Not always.
Yeah.
It's not guaranteed. So it's a little more nuanced. This study, as Daniel was kind of pointing at, we didn't get the documentation, so it's sort of, the study kind of failed if you, not study, but the project failed, oh, that sounds bad. There was a missing, the assumptions didn't get filled in, right? The binding constraints of, okay, people are gonna demand these documents. And that's gonna lead then to people getting the documents, and then all of these other indicators, that didn't happen. So the project assumed that by strengthening the institutions, people would demand. And so by increasing that legal knowledge and by strengthening institutions, that would lead to the demand of documentation. And it did. So, yeah, so I.
Yeah, so I think it's the other.
You said it varied across areas.
Yeah, how much is documentation?
Like how much documentation is there?
How much we get.
Oh, it varies wildly. So it's quite expensive. So I think the other assumption was that this would only happen in rural communes. It was designed to only happen in rural communes. And then we saw that like 11 of our communes had become urban by the end line. And even more were experiencing kind of urbanization and were peri-urban. So I think there's maybe 35,000 APFRs total across the study area, but it's really uneven. You know, like there's one peri-urban commune that has like 11,000. Oh, and then yes, and then it was also in peri-urban areas much more expensive because there was actually demand for it there, and they could charge a lot of money.
You must say if the cost is very low, then the place is more adoption.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, on that happy note. Thank you. Let's say thanks again. Okay, next, Dee is going to take us to study in India.
You didn't introduce me or read out my bio. I'm kidding.
I'm really bad in telephones. Okay, so,
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. I know it's a packed session, so happy to see people here. I'm Priya. I am a lawyer by training. I used to be a corporate lawyer in another life. Now I work in public policy with big on this, so here I am. I lead research on land at our Burkina Faso area here in Mumbai. This study is largely based in India. So before I go into it, there was an interesting point you raised about the fact that there are all of these assumptions in the field of land, and all of them might not necessarily hold true in a lot of the countries that we work in. And that was actually a big motivation for us to examine this question, which is that in India, at least, there was this big push towards the digitization of the land record system. And the idea was that, look, if you digitize it, everything will be great. You'll increase investment, you'll increase access to finance and household, which is what we said. With the limitations in data that we have, are we able to look at this in a bit more detail? So I'll just set the context for this work. I know a lot of you all have worked in India or about the Indian context, so I'll tell you a little bit about it so you'll be able to understand it better. I'll then talk about our study, which is, I'll tell you the research question that we're after, the data design, our findings, and then I'll quickly take you through the takeaways. I've limited how technical I've made this just because it's probably more interesting than not. Before I go into talking about household balance sheets in India, because we do look at this at the household level, I do want to say that in the constitutional scheme in India, land is divided across central and state subjects, so much like the federal structure that we all have in the US. But in India, what happens is the states have the power to legislate over land. So all of the policy decisions largely come from the center, but the implementation and the specifics of these programs are all done by states. Many times states, of course, are the drivers of these programs. So you have significant differences across states. So state A may be very different from state B in terms of its land records, the way they look, and also, of course, the implementation. That's what we exploit in this. So I'll tell you a little bit about household balance sheets in India, and this is important because we are talking about maintaining and following access to finance. So if you look at household balance sheets, there are three unusual features. Firstly, we see that, and I say unusual when compared to developed countries, we see that real estate assets have a predominance in the household asset portfolio. So about 77% of household assets are in the form of real estate in India. The second is that despite this, debt is still unsecured. So if you look at the debt component in household balance sheet, you'll see that it's largely unsecured debt, which means that mortgages form a very, very small part of the liabilities, meaning that the collateralization is perhaps. And why is this unusual? Because typically when there is information asymmetry about the creditworthiness of borrowers, which is what we do have in India as well, banks would rely on land as collateral for many reasons, right? It's easily identifiable, it's fixed, it doesn't run away out of the jurisdiction of the bank, and its value appreciates over time. But in the Indian paradox, we see that despite having a high percentage of real estate assets, unsecured debt is high, collateralization seems to not be happening, and data suggests that lending is happening based on income and mortgage-based lending is not happening as much. So what's going on? There could be a number of things going on. The literature seems to say that this is because of the land records infrastructure that exists in the manner it does in India. So I'll just explain what I mean by the land records infrastructure. In India, when you do a transaction, you have to register your deed, the agreement that you entered with. You also need to update your name in government land records. So it's a two-step process. So when I say the land records infrastructure, I mean the registration part. I also mean the part where you have your record of rights for your needs. Okay. So the literature seems to say that this is the reason why you don't have access to finance. Now, the land records infrastructure we think may affect mortgage-based credit access because first of all, it seeks to reduce information asymmetry. So you're putting the information out there in a digitized way. It's easily accessible. Ideally, this should reduce your screening costs. So as a lender, you typically have two main costs. You have screening and enforcement costs. Screening costs are what you essentially do to check the quality of the collateral, perhaps, or the creditworthiness of a borrower. And the enforcement cost is that will incur if there is a default. So we think that the land records infrastructure, perhaps if it's better, might reduce this cost. So our question essentially is, does the quality of the land records infrastructure affect households' access to credit in India? And I know that this is posed as also a question, but it's not. We don't go into further because we don't have a history enough data to actually do that. So we think this is important because access to credit helps households move or conserve shocks to their income. We also see that households use credit to improve their economic status, and firms also deliver more credit where there is lower information asymmetry, what we just spoke about. And if access to credit has links with the land records infrastructure, the quality of it, it supports a case for policy efforts to either continue the way they have or to slightly change course and maybe think about what else in the credit. So we seek to empirically examine the link between the quality of the land records infrastructure and household credit access. And what we do is really exploit the quality of land records. So state A versus state B versus state C will have different levels of quality of the land records, levels of digitization. So that's what we exploit here. We use two data sets. I'll just briefly tell you a little bit about it. So the first data that we use is something called the LRSI, the Land Record Services Index, which was created in 2019 by an organization in India. They did this for 33 states. And what they do is they relatively score states across these 5 measures in terms of examining how, to what extent they've been digitized, to what extent the quality maps with what is actually on ground. So we were also part of another study where we did the mapping exercise, compared what was on the record versus what's on ground. So some of that we We use a number of methods to do this. It's not so difficult. If you have a score of 0, you're very bad. If you have a score of 100, you waste. Okay, so that's how it goes. The next data set that we look at is the consumer pyramids data set. It's a great data set in India. We work with it much more than we do with census data because we just think that the quality of the data and the numerator is much better. So it's a national survey of 175,000 households. They are surveyed twice a year. So the same household is surveyed, the same person is surveyed across different ways within the same year. And you have this data available from 2014 onwards. And what is available is a lot. What we have used is essentially whether households borrow. We look at the source of borrowing. So where did they borrow from? Here you see that we have categorized the source of borrowing into formal and informal. This is a categorization that we have applied. They just ask households to borrow from banks, microfinance institutions, so on. So this is our categorization. Informal is essentially anything which is not within the official banking system. It could be friends, if you have some kind of credit line and shorts or anything. We also look at what households borrow for. That becomes relevant to the later part of this presentation. And we also get the location of the houses, like in the rural area or now in the literature we see this, the topic of access to finance is contentious because you need to determine or propose a measure of access to finance. So we use that as access to credit. So if you are a borrower household, we assume that you have access to credit. So we essentially look at the fraction of households that are borrower households versus not. We also look at the fraction of households that borrow from formal sources, as we categorized previously, versus informal sources. And we just test the strength of the correlation between borrower households and the state level LRSI scores. So these scores are done at the level of the state. So each state gets an overall score, and they also have scores across each of the 5 components, which is registration, your textual records, which are where the names are recorded, spatial records, which are your maps, as well as the quality of land records, where they look at the disparity between cost of ground versus people. So we have 2 hypotheses. One, and this is based on the literature, that if you have better land record infrastructure through digitization and through verification, it enables higher access to credit. So you will, at the first level, have more number of households borrowing than not. And the second is that you will have them borrowing from the formal sector versus not, which is the aim of a lot of these programs. So what's new? This is potentially the first multi-state empirical analysis linking credit and land records in India. We have problems, and this has been done well. I think the World Bank had a paper, Klaus had a paper for one particular state, which was Haiti, which was done back in the day. This is, again, like I said, it's not a causal analysis. Okay? And we have some limitations, which is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. We knew that data collection was concerned, so we couldn't do that. So I'll quickly take you through our findings. I'm going to first take you through. I'm going to just take you through the data first, just in the form of tables before we look at the estimations. So what you see before you are 3 columns. You have the states in India, which are categorized as low LRSI versus high. So how we set this up is that we just group states with opposite values. So the lower RSI states are the ones that have scored very badly, the ones that are high have higher scores. We also then, in the last column, that's the borrower household is the percentage of borrower households and the post-stream households. So if you look at the mean values, what we would expect is that in the lower RSI states with the lower scores of poorer quality of land records, you would expect a lower number of households that borrow or access finance, which we are seeing when compared with the higher RSI states that have a larger, better quality land records. But, if you look a little bit closely to this, you will see some challenges there, which is that if you notice the lower RSI states, look at Sikkim and Chandigarh, which is the second and third over there. You see not much difference in their score, but you see the percentage of borrower households are very, very. Similarly, you do see an exception in Jammu and Kashmir, which is 91% of households are borrower households. You see more consistency in the higher RSI states, but if you also were to just compare, like for like, you would see that overall, however, on the higher RSI states, the percentage of borrower households. If we just look at this a little more closely, now we move from overall borrowing to formal versus informal. What we would expect is that in the lower RSI states, you would have households borrowing from informal sources because of the lack of documentation. And in high RSI, you'd see more households borrowing for formal sources, but actually we see the opposite. We don't see households with better land records borrowing necessarily from formal sources. We see that it continues in informal sources. Here, the beta coefficient is essentially the coefficient of interest for us, which tells us how the borrower or how a borrower household changes or the sort of borrowing, whether a household becomes a borrower household or not with the change in the RSI scores. Okay. So when I say all here, it means all households borrowing, regardless of what the source is, and then it becomes formal versus informal. Again, what we're seeing here is essentially the same as we saw in the tables, which is that there is a positive correlation if you are a borrower household, but that is, in informal and formal, it's a bit inverted. It's counterintuitive to what you actually think. You don't actually see that households, or there's no statistical correlation really between formal borrowing and a lower analysis score. We also see that in rural areas, this score seems to matter more than it does in urban areas, and that sort of makes sense. Amongst all of the components, though, and I think it's interesting to say that spatial records are something that repeatedly show up with a relatively stronger correlation than any of the other scores. So it's spatial records followed by registration. Textual records don't seem to have very strong correlation. And this is interesting because when we did have chats with lenders in the field and took them by this research, they said that, this kind of makes sense because we rely a lot on maps. That's where the big gap is for us in terms of information asymmetry. So we can have better quality maps, then sure we're more likely to think about that. Because drug costs, scales. Okay, sure. So just quickly taking you through this. So, we were curious about what might be going on because one of the big ideas of this is it's just not a land record story. There must be something else going on. Maybe some supplier demands and variables that also affect this. So on the supply side, really quickly, I'm going to take you through it. We examined whether the presence of financial institutions has anything to do with this, and it could explain why, despite having poorer quality land records, there is more borrowing in formal sources. So we actually did see that in per capita, the number of branches per household is more in states with a poorer score, and perhaps that's why they're borrowing more from formal sources. We also ran regressions on this, and we also see a positive correlation, which is pretty significant at 95% confidence level here. And that might be something else that's going on, which also goes to show that sure, digitization is great, but it's not fast. So, the other thing we examined is the demand side constraints, which is that is there something about borrower behavior that forces them to borrow in a certain way from a particular source? So what we actually do see is interesting. We categorize their borrowing across capital and non-capital purposes. So non-capital are the really quick loans that they need for weddings, for funerals, unplanned, and so smaller ticket size, where they probably can't get that finance from a formal institution. And we actually see that in lower LRSI states, which have poorer quality land records, households tend to borrow for these quick purposes, and therefore they don't borrow for this, they borrow for more capital long-term purposes, and therefore companies are able to finance them. Whereas in the higher states, we see them borrowing for quick purposes. That may be part of the story. One interesting thing I will tell you there is that if you are a household, and this is what we figured from the estimation we did, that if you are a household in a high LRSI state and you're a borrower housing, if you are an agriculturist and if you own property, you are more likely to borrow for a capital purpose from a financial institution. We have detailed results in the paper, of course. I'm going to stop here. Do positive time.
Yeah.
Okay. So the score is not. So I just think about whether the score account for how much lending is happening.
How much lending is
So the score is purely captures the infrastructure.
It just captures the infrastructure. It's different. That is the matching or the correlation analysis.
Yeah, and the another thing is this correlation. So I thought, okay, the place with higher scores also more likely many more banks. Right? So I think this probably is not
No, it's actually the other way around.
Huh?
We're actually seeing the other way around. We're seeing that in states, and that's one of the explanations we give, which is that in states, states that have lower LRSI scores actually have a higher presence of financial institutions. I don't think those two facts are related. It's not tested for them.
Yeah, but I think it's just, if you have that, then great. It's supporting.
Yeah.
The state also very good. So I think you may want to look a little below the state level, so more variation. Maybe you can do some depression.
It's a cross section, right? That's
Yeah.
So this indicator doesn't change over time. I mean, it's just in this one, and you managed to control for some household level factors, right? This is the state level indicator. There are quite many other things happening in the states. So I don't know how to interpret any of that result. It's you won't be able to control for mistakes in the seconds. Might pick up all other factors.
So we do control for state level GDP, which is income of the state. We do also, so we can control for that, which is because we states of the outcome relative to each other, so we do control for that. And also the housing that we control occupation, land ownership, and we find that some houses have land ownership. The variation is whether or not they're agricultural housing versus whether they're rural housing versus without the housing, even we how it access even more.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you have data.
No, so that's yes, right. So the data that we have in terms of products is which is what scores these land networks is for the year 2019. They did do an updated version in 2021. We haven't yet done taking this forward in 2021, but we shall do in terms of what we see as difference to that. And also there's a lot of migration that happened in India around COVID. So I think that the veracity and robustness of that survey data that we get on households may slightly be affected because the same, I mean, the beauty of this data set is that you have the same set of households and the same person in the household used to be interviewed across the years, whereas this for a lot of information happened. So we're not sure. We understand. They do have a data set to do something.
I'm really interested in this, like, the supply of loans as well, and I didn't catch if the survey has some state location, but you could like interact the distance to a bank with this and like sort of get at, within a state, is there a different relationship? And I think that could be really interesting in getting at some of these questions.
No, that's a great comment. So when we were trying to do supply side explanations to this, we actually came at it exactly as you said. We were really interested in thinking about whether if I'm a household which is located within X distance of the bank, am I more likely to borrow versus not more formal institutions? Things in India, we have a problem of addresses. So it's very difficult, first of all, within the survey data that we use to exactly locate a household. We know the region that they belong to and we know whether they're in urban or rural area. We don't know which, we have a sense up to a division called the district level in India, where we know where they're from, but then lower than that it becomes very difficult. And while we're able to get background presence, we're not able to do that at the household level for the location of the household, which is why we calculated the number of bank branches per capita. Also, maybe a few years ago, the RBI had put in this requirement that banks in India have branches in the rural areas that increase their branch presence.
But then just to push like the effect of your score, your like quality of records score interacted with the banks. So like are these records more important if you have a bank near you?
Right, understood. Yeah, which is similar to
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, well, let's say thanks again for this. Okay, so it is going to take us to Mozambique.
I have a tendency to shout, so apologies. Perfect. So this is, I'm going to stand up, it's a little easier for me. I'm going to be sharing new evidence on land demarcation, input subsidies, and agricultural investment from a recent study in Mozambique. This is short work together with a couple people in the room, Claire Boxo, João Montalbão, Michael Sylvan, of us at the Gender Innovation Lab, and then an incoming student at PSE, Mateus Troy. So while the share of the population in agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa is falling, the sector remains a key driver of rural economies throughout the region. Despite this, it continues to be characterized by limited investment and low productivity. Theory suggests that insecure property rights may constrain agricultural investment in small and represent a barrier to investment for several reasons. Farmers may be reluctant or unable to invest due to kind of the risk of expropriation, risk of losing kind of the return on any investment that they're making, or the risk of losing the actual underlying investment that they're making in the land as well. Or due to kind of the inability to collateralize their loan, to kind of support market transactions, access credit markets. Recent evidence has shown kind of a relationship along some domains between land tenure security and agricultural investment, particularly in the form of kind of the duration that farmers are willing to keep their land fallow, the likelihood that they want to kind of maintain the nutrients within the soil, their ability to kind of invest in longer term assets, such as putting trees on their plots. But decidedly, for the evidence is kind of a little more mixed, despite kind of some of these encouraging impacts. And there's a kind of a dearth of rigorous kind of experimental evidence on the impacts of land tenure security on agricultural investment practices. One of the reasons for, or potential reasons for this, relatively mixed evidence is that farmers may face other constraints. So they may face kind of binding access to capital constraints. They may face kind of, there are a host of them, but access to capital or really limit their ability to capitalize on their increased land tenure security and make the investments in their land. The second key motivation for us is trying to better understand what land rights look like in matrilineal context. So there are several existing studies focusing on the potential to increase women's land rights in matrilineal contexts by encouraging households to co-title land. But there's still relatively little known about kind of formalizing land rights in matrilineal contexts. So are there systematic differences in self-reported tenure security across land owned by men and land owned by women within these kind of matrilineal contexts? How do behaviors change in terms of co-titling? So you could think about a context in which women kind of de facto own the land under customary regimes. You go in, you kind of encourage co-titling. They may be pressured to put their husband on the land, and it actually lowers women's land rights in the longer term. And finally, within this context, does tenure insecurity really represent kind of a binding constraint to agricultural investment? We examined these questions in the context of an international NGO implemented sustainable agriculture program for smallholder farmers in matrilineal area of Mozambique. We focus on two project components: a conditional land titling intervention and an input package, a subsidized input package. I'm going to talk a little bit about both of these before I get into the study design. The conditional land titling is comprised basically offering households the opportunity to register their largest plot of land, conditional on including a woman's name on the title. So they could either do this alone, or if the head of the household was a man, they had to include kind of the head woman within the household. So typically that's the husband or the man's wife. A couple of key points here. First, all land in Mozambique, much like was described for Burkina Faso earlier, all land in Mozambique is owned by the state. It is not collateralizable. So that really limits kind of the avenues of it towards through which we could expect to see this kind of shifting agricultural investment. It's really kind of reducing the risk of expropriation rather than kind of facilitating access to credit. The second actually key point I want to make just on this is we're really focusing on land demarcation. So all of the activities here were conducted to support registration with the local land authorities. So demarcation was done by kind of authorized field agents. All of the documentation was completed. It was submitted to the land formalization authorities. Something like 80+% of those applications were approved, but the titles never were delivered to the household only after the end of our study. So it kind of took 2+ years for those titles to actually make it into the hands. This is, there's evidence in other settings that demarcation alone, just kind of the process, starting this process is sufficient to change investment behaviors, and that's kind of what we're focusing on here. There are a couple different ways that land titling, land formalization you could expect to impact households. So one is it kind of reducing the risk of expropriation. Households are more willing to invest in their land. They might be limited in their ability to do that due to things like credit constraints. Another is that it kind of facilitates shifts off farm. I'm less worried about someone stealing my land, so I now go and I sort of stall in the market. Really, so we designed a second intervention to try to really examine that first component. So can we ease land tenure security constraints, ease credit constraints, and see whether that leads to households really intensifying their agricultural production. So we did this through a discounted agricultural input package that was again offered to the head woman within the household. This is a pretty large package. It had a market value of about $330. It was designed by a kind of program agronomists to provide both short-term and long-term benefits. So really the goal was to help these households make longer-term investments in their land. So yeah, this is kind of just what kind of a mix of shorter-term inputs, maize, together with kind of fertilizer and insecticide. These are really aiming to boost immediate current season agricultural production. You also have things like fruit tree seedlings. Obviously, it takes several years for those to produce fruit and kind of any return on that investment. It's also included training on climate smart agriculture practices to support this kind of, again, this longer term investment in the land, sustainably maintaining the nutrients within the soil. That's all I want to comment. So we developed a two-stage experimental design centered around these two program components. First, you can think about this just as kind of the cross-randomization of these two interventions, where we're going to look at kind of the direct, short, and slightly longer term, but still short-term impacts of the land title alone, the input package alone, and their combination. Within this input package sample, we then embedded a willingness to pay experiment, and I'll throw kind of what this looks like in practice. This aims to really measure the direct short-term impacts of this land registration activity on a willingness to invest. Basically, if I provide a land title to somebody, does that increase their willingness to buy this short-term investment bundle, or kind of, sorry, the land agricultural investment bundle? And we look at not only kind of whether demarcation shifts your willingness to invest, but also how that interacts with varying subsidy levels. So just very concretely, this kind of first row here represents our cross-cutting randomization. We have a sample of just about 1,000 households randomized into 4 different groups: land registration and input package, the input package alone, and the control group. This green, and then so for kind of the short term and then slightly longer short-term impacts, we're going to look at impacts at midline, collected 1 year after the intervention, and then at endline. Focusing on households that receive the input package, we have this kind of willingness to pay experiment. So for those households, you can kind of, the key difference between the input package and the combination package is that half of them went through kind of this land demarcation activity. So what we're doing is looking just in this set of on the impact of having your land demarcated on kind of this package offer, whether it changes your willingness to buy this package. And I'll talk about how we did that recently. In general, these women in our study are generally representative of women in the region. They're about 37 years old. Pretty low education in the region. They only have about 2 years of education on average. Large household, they live with about 5.5 other people. The second line is kind of what I was talking about earlier. We're not going to get a lot into it today, but 70% of these households are matrilineal. And that kind of has key implications for land rights within the region. So 40% of the women in our study reported that they owned the land on their own. I think one of the discussions earlier, we were talking about kind of the fact that land ownership is multidimensional. Even though 40% report that they own it on their own, only about 24% reported that they could sell it on their own. So this is consistent also with kind of this matrilineal context where It may not be your husband, it may be your uncle, it may be another kind of male relative that has some claim or some ability to determine what you are doing with that land, even if you kind of, even if the women in this community kind of view it as that they own it on land. Main crops here, just maize, pigeon peas, and soy is actually going to play kind of a key role in the impacts that we're seeing. We've had take up of this conditional land title loan offer, so in line with kind of this matrilineal context, the requirement of including a woman's name on the title did not really dissuade people from registering lands. Similarly, 90% of the households completing the willingness to pay experiment. Crucially, we then collapsed the study back to kind of that cross randomization. So everyone that completed the willingness to pay experiment was then provided with the input bundle at no cost. So this was kind of done in consultation with the NGO that we were working with. This boosts our power back to kind of the 4 cross cutting study arms without kind of weakening it by whatever the take-up rate is or the acceptance rate of that willingness to pay experiment. And I can show that just again really quickly here. So at the end of package delivery, regardless of whether you accepted the offer that I'm about to describe, it's a little abstract now. We basically collapse it back to here, and you can think about everyone getting, or 90% of households getting the land registration, 90+% getting the input package, and then no one in the control group getting those various activities. So what is this package offer? How did we implement this willingness to pay experiment? So this was a take it or leave it offer. You can think about it just as presenting households with an opportunity to purchase an input bundle. So we went to women assigned to receive the input bundle and offered them just kind of, do you want to buy this package? We described it. We said that it was kind of framed around the woman, around kind of aiming to boost her ability to access and use inputs. And we offered the bundle to her at one of 4 randomly selected prices, or 4 randomly selected subsidy levels. So either 87%, 79%, 71%, or 63% discount on the full bundle price. These seem arbitrary. They have nice round metric price values associated with each of them. We implemented this trying to avoid the idea that short-term liquidity constraints could change their decision. So we basically delayed any payments that they would. We said, do you want to buy this? You don't have to pay for it today. You have to pay for it, half of it when we deliver the first set of inputs, half of it when we deliver the second set of inputs for the second agriculture season. So this is really trying to ensure that it's in conflict. So in speaking with kind of the implementing partner, they agreed that they would have enough time basically, and these weren't prices that were so exorbitant that if they wanted to get these funds, they would be able to go out and get these funds. It's not a liquidity constraint, or should not be a liquidity constraint given kind of the time that they had to go out and get it. After reiterating and confirming that they kind of understood the offer, we basically said, do you want to buy it? Here's the price. And this is our key outcome for this willingness to pay activity. Did you accept the offer at this price? Not a lot to say here, just our main outcome here is, did you accept it? We're looking at the impact of having your land demarcated. Just remember, for the input package recipients, half of them had their land demarcated just in the weeks leading up to this offer. And then we're looking at kind of how that varies across different subsidy levels. This figure kind of summarizes our results. So here on the x-axis, you have the price that was offered. Y-axis is the share of households that accepted the offer at any given price, and then split across. So you can think about the circles as kind of treatment. They have their land demarcated right before the offer. If land demarcation reduced the risk of expropriation and increased the the recipient's willingness to invest in agricultural inputs, you would expect kind of a vertical shift upwards. Basically, at any given price, you're now more likely, more willing to buy this input package. On average, it increases your expected return across prices. In contrast to that, we actually see relatively, muted impacts mixed across different prices. You kind of see a little more variation at 1,000 and 11,000. But those both have, they're small end cells, few observations in either of those, because we ended up kind of dropping 1,000 and 11,000 and putting the rest across the middle prices. In terms of kind of the last thing I want to say about this, because I think it really summarizes our results, in contrast to land formalization, which does not seem to drive your investment behavior, does not seem to drive whether you accept this bundle, price really changes, right? The subsidy really changes demand for this agricultural input bundle. For every 2,000 metric increase in subsidy, we see about an 11 percentage point increase in the likelihood of accepting this bundle. This is showing that. We also don't see much, we don't see that kind of the impacts of the registration varies by subsidy level. So we don't see much in terms of kind of this land demarcation shifting very short-term willingness to invest. So there are a couple things that could be going on. One is that, this input bundle did not represent or comprise the kind of investments that these houses wanted to make. So maybe we're offering very specific crops. They want to invest in their land with different cash crops or different, maybe it's physical infrastructure that they want to buy. So we follow up with, as I mentioned, collapsing the design, looking at kind of the longer term, again, still not long term, 1 year, 2 year follow-ups on the impacts of the 3 different treatment lines. Again, I'm a big fan of this figure. I would just put this figure up for the whole presentation if I could. But now we're just doing the 4 treatment arms, abstracting all of this, and just package delivery, midline, and months. We're focusing on kind of 1 year and 2 year impacts. Again, pretty standard regression. So what do we see after 1 year? And I have all the tables for these if anyone's interested in seeing them. I think it's a little easier to just kind of our highlights. We see some evidence that this land demarcation decreased land tenure and security. This is not significant. I don't want to oversell this, and it's not a particularly large impact either. We don't see any evidence on-farm or off-farm investment behaviors. The input package increased non-labor inputs, so in line with kind of the delivery. We provided fertilizer, we provided training on how they could invest in their land with climate smart agriculture practices. In line with this, we see that they use the fertilizer, they increase their non-labor inputs, they increase their use of improved seeds. This was provided as part of that input package. And they start following some of those climate smart agriculture practices, kind of really investing in longer term their land. Together, these yielded a negative impact on harvest value. What actually happened here? So kind of really digging into it, we see that farmers shifted from the other dominant cash crop in the region, from soy to the butter beans, which was kind of the cash crop that was provided as part of this input bundle, but then experienced high crop loss as a result of that. They report a high frequency of, I don't recall whether it was drought or flooding. One of them that basically wiped out this cash crop that they planted instead of soy. So they see a drop in soy harvest. They see no increase in kind of the value of their butterbean harvest. Together, kind of netting with a net decrease in harvest value. The combined bundles, kind of lumping together the land registration and the input package, yielded basically both of these sets of impacts. Stretching it out to the next year, after 2 years, land registration impacts largely wane. So they kind of felt better about the land after 1 year. still didn't have a title after 2 years, maybe started to wonder whether how secure their land was. We also see that the investment impacts associated with this input bundle circulate as well. So we don't see any change at the 2-year follow-up in terms of these non-labor inputs, using fertilizer, using improved seeds. We also see that they largely abandoned the climate smart agricultural practices. So they saw that this crop shift and farming practices shift that they employed in the first year together decreased their harvest, so they abandoned it wholesale. They returned to their earlier practices, they returned to their earlier crop composition, but still find a persistent drop in harvest value. So basically, they are not able to fully expand their soy harvest back, or their soy area cultivated back to what they were doing pre-program. So there's still kind of this persistent drop in soy harvest. Very kind of cautionary tale about efforts to shift, particularly away from, this is somewhere around 10% of the households in the region were already farming butter beans. It's a remunerative crop in this area, but they just seem to be much more familiar with soy. I will also say that this was kind of mid-COVID, so we're not sure whether it really hampered the NGO's ability to provide the ongoing extension services that were normally part of their kind of core activities. Really quick before I open it up, in general, we find limited evidence supporting short-term investment impacts of land demarcation. We see no impacts on this willingness to purchase this short-term investment bundle through that kind of willingness to pay experiment. We also find no evidence of impacts on 1-year or 2-year on-farm or off-farm investment behaviors. Just to stress again, this super package is really a cautionary tale. Shifting the relative prices of these inputs changed planting behaviors with really persistent negative impacts. And just to kind of put it in perspective, since I didn't show the tables, it led to about a 15% decrease in harvest values. So not trivial. Also with kind of large implications for this shift towards climate smart agriculture. Even though, I'm trying to remember, we teased apart whether it was the climate smart agriculture practices that were leading to the negative impacts. And it really looked like it was not that. It was kind of the shock on this crop specific, cash crop specific shock. But regardless, they abandoned these kind of smart farming practices. In line with, I love the fact that you guys have 10-year follow-up data. I really think it's I know there are challenges inherent with that. This does not rule out longer term impacts. I would love to see more on that. I also heard several references to kind of peri-urban communities. You guys talked about that. I don't know, I'm kind of, the evidence on rural demarcation, I don't think, and rural registration is not solid. I think there's slightly more encouraging evidence on peri-urban stuff. Anyways, yeah, it does not rule out longer term impacts. My dreamland study would be like a peri-urban, an urbanizing area with super long term impacts. Thank you.
So just your favorite figure.
Yeah. It's like the same thing.
No. So just to, is this randomized, were these randomized community levels?
It was individual level, yeah.
Individual, so within a community, you would have some individuals that received the registration plus input, but their neighbors might only have received the input and could not be registered. Like, was there selection? So they couldn't have selected into the.
Correct. I mean, so in theory, so the land formalization effort here, these yield things called DUAs. They're land use certificates, basically. It is, in theory, a farmer could go out and get one of these, but the service providers are not. Okay. The service providers are not allowed to actually do it. So you- yeah.
That was my second question, was this the do-I for
Yes.
the individual, so it's like a systematic version, okay, and then last question, so when you guys looked at the investment indicators, I assume this was definitely done, like, do you look at survivorship of this, of the tree planting, you gave them some trees, did you look at like,
So we looked at kind of that, they're no more likely to report having trees at kind of the 1 or 2 year follow-ups. As any tree. So about 3/4 of households, but this is in both treatment and control communities, report having a tree on their plot. I should say, here we're focusing on averages across plots, even though we titled one plot, the plot specific results are the same. We don't have kind of a plot, we thought about kind of counting trees or like plots. How many trees and what kind of trees do you have on this? I think we still actually do have some data on that. But we did not look at kind of survivorship of those in that way. Like how many of those that we gave you did, lasted or lived through to the next season. And one other quick point on your comment. Yes, this was sporadic land registration. We have a sibling project layered on top of the Moz land that is done at kind of community level randomization, leveraging kind of the national systematic land registration effort.
oh, so wait, you guys didn't systematically, or do they have to provide, they have to pay for their own?
No, they were provided at no cost, but this was kind of, because it was individual registration, individual level demarcation, like sporadic, yeah.
Yeah. So no, I'm just wondering, this expert and especially the land registration, selling different balance packing, but what you were saying there is registering the woman, maybe, prayer is she has the right to the land, right? So I think.
No, please.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one. And the second one is if they're in the secondary market or inputs, is you're giving them huge discount, like more than 50%. So,
So I forgot to.
and it's very able to input there, that hosts them or whether you have any enforcement of use.
We see no evidence that they were more likely to sell inputs. We did ask about that during the follow-up, whether they sold any seed that they had kind of going into this agricultural season. We don't see any evidence that they sold the inputs that were provided to them. Clearly, like definitely, and this was a survey implemented by kind of a separate kind of entity. It was not affiliated with the implementing partner, but yeah, it could definitely be a case. We just don't see evidence. In terms of whether this was an patrilineal community, or like, I think the relevance of the co-titling, it certainly changes kind of the incentives there, and whether we would be whether that would represent a more binding constraint on whether they accept the offer, and whether it would be more likely to kind of shift intra-household dynamics. And I think it was really interesting that you were seeing evidence of the pushback from registering women on the titles in Burkina. The other study, the Mozambique study, it's a little more mixed, but it is definitely more patrilineal in nature. The evidence from Uganda that Joao and others have, like, are you on that? In fact, I don't know. Suggests that you are able to get women on titles even in patrilineal areas, maybe without kind of really harmful and with relatively light budgets.
And my question was in fact the same as your second question, so it has more than been answered, but I'm still quite amazed that there's no market for selling these kind of things, because you would expect that quite some of these households are quite liquidity constrained, so you need quite some pressure to sell them because they have quite some subsidy. So they might use it for other purposes. And also because you find after 2 years, when you start going back to the original planting, still harvests are lower. So we might try to check it again. Whether there was really no selling going on. Okay?
Fair. I had one thought on that. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to know, you said that. So what's the compliance rate? So what is his intention?
Yes, it is.
So,
And so we had kind of 92% take up of the land registration, and then about similar take up of the info funnel, delivery of the info funnel. And I do remember my point, which was one of the things that may have limited the extent to which they could sell these inputs was basically these were delivered right pre-planted. So households would have largely needed to make their planting decisions, acquire their inputs right around the time that they are making the purchase decision. So if you say no to buying this, you really needed to go out and make an alternative plan for what kind of inputs you're using. So basically anyone that even if I receive kind of a bunch of inputs, and you all and we're all in the same community, you've made a real mistake if you have not already developed a planting plan for the coming season by the time I receive my inputs.
Did they have to take a package or pick and choose?
I mean, they received the whole package, and they were not, because it was kind of just this one-off offer at a certain price, they could not pick the components. It was basically like, do you want this bundle?
So it has the seedlings and so on.
Yes.
what is surprising is because the willingness to get type is very high, 92%. And then simply the not, at least a shop of not advantage of. So only in other channels, the benefit, or you will not capture it. After I saw Jennifer there, so I looked down in Mozambique a little bit, so I know you are. But also they have pipe done by ACC. I'm not sure which area, we also have a community level kind of.
You're Heather, picture.
Oh, there we go.
After on these two workouts, I was laughing when we were explaining the duo. Presented beforehand though.
We got time for one more question. Go ahead.
So very quickly, you gave us the market value of the inputs, but aren't there other input subsidy programs in Mozambique? Or have those ended?
I know that there's the prominent paper, but yeah, we should look at our data to see whether there were similar input programs kind of operating in our area. The use of improved input seeds among kind of the control group was very low, and the use of fertilizer was also very low, suggesting that they were not active.
And then secondly, because this is within village randomization, your control group is still planting soy, they're also hit by the drought or flood or whatever it was. And so is soy more resilient to? So
we really need to get back in touch with the program agronomist that kind of devised this to better understand what may have happened and specifically why it seems to have been a crop specific shock. Yeah.
All right, let's say thanks one more time. Okay. And lastly, Song King's gonna what's interesting stuff from Vietnam.
Okay, so I thought titling is more study, more significant than land law. So I can put out at least for this afternoon, I maybe see a little bit more impact from land law without titling than titling. So it's a little bit more interesting. So actually that paper is also, so actually most of the work is done by Cham, so it's a monitor of these rooms. So she's a PhD student of mine and also work with Klaus and Diane, so we're from World Bank. Before I went to the MSU, I worked at the bank for 4 years, and closely with Klaus and at that time Burkina Faso and the other people here. Okay, so the title of this is related to the land law of Vietnam, including the 13th land law. I will explain they have actually a series of law every 10 years in Vietnam. So we want to evaluate the law, mainly focus on the transfer activities. And Vietnam, actually, they started with very similar land property rights like China and also probably Ethiopia, very similar. But now somehow they even a little bit ahead because China never allowed to sell these rights for the duration of the rights, right? But Vietnam actually is already allowed. They started with the reform much later. But now Ethiopia actually still remains very similar to China. So we'll focus on that transfer right, land transfer, but also look at some other outcome, economic outcomes too. So just formality, and I start introduce a little bit and explain what's the land law and what's the context in Vietnam, and then propose some hypotheses and analysis and conclude. Okay, so I think in this audience we all know, okay, access and also the use of land is really crucial for productivity and also for economic growth. Okay? And also the efficient, the many outcome positive good things if have efficient land markets or sales markets, right? So a lot of study now about misallocation, like that Susia and other group of people working on that. Actually, ourselves, I work with Klaus and others, quite a number of papers. I saw people here, Daniel and Nick and many along this line. And then, of course, I also found it has a big impact on income and also poverty alleviation, and then food security, and of course, also the economic structure transformation. If people moving also has effect on the labor market, so people move from oversupply in farm now less in farm, so foresee transformation. But on the same time, we all know, okay, this market land rental or sales are still, as I said, banned in China, and then even the rental market is not all working very well in many of these countries. Okay, so many reasons. Okay, and we see some of them are local restrictions, some of the government restrictions. Like Ethiopia, only they have restricted a certain amount can lease, but not all the land. In China, they have only restrict to lease to your village within the same village, but not outside of village. So a lot of different, and also in India, the sharecropping and all these are banned to some degree, and so a lot of it is restriction. But another thing is very big is the tenure security. Okay, so tenure security is one of the main hindrances to the effective functioning of land market. But on the other hand, to improve the security and link with the land market, so a lot of studies really focus more on the tenure land titling, particularly papers on land titling. But if you look at the literature, a lot of about land titling that's from many different countries, and one of the indicators also linked with the land market participation, right? But however, on the other hand, if you just think about other non-titled, but can you strengthening efforts like land law, you look at relatively less study. Okay, so with your, I think a few papers done that. Also, then has done a couple in Ethiopia too. And then we really want to use this opportunity of the new law in Vietnam, try to fill this gap and look at the impacts, some direct effect on land transfers. Okay? But we also want to look whether that has efficiency impact, additional efficiency impact or not, and also look at other employment and or just the overall welfare income or expenditure. Actually, you know, this expenditure with income we found it's a little bit noisy. Of course, and then this, because as I said, its context of Vietnam is interesting because every 10 years they want to have this law, okay? And of course, the finding will be have some guidance for the future reform, and also very similar, I think, in Vietnam, for other many countries also want to improve that. So methodologically, we find it's also a good opportunity because this law only affects one type of land. Okay, so affect annual land, but not perennial land. So kind of create this opportunity for us to use BID. Okay, so and then we have before a few years and after a few years, and we use this. So I think this is a good opportunity because many other study about land rental, more about the determinants, and so it's less. So it's, I think it's a good opportunity. And then the question is very clear, very simple. Okay, first just look at how does that affect land rental and sales activities. Okay, and then also look whether there's efficiency implication, really not only more sales or more rental, whether rental and sales also facilities or moves the right direction, right? And then the last one is look some of the other outcome variables. So the Vietnam, the land, as I just mentioned, is allowed to sell, but sale is not the ownership. They sell the use rights. So if you have 20 years, you sell for 20 years. Okay, if you have 50 years, you sell for 50 years. Okay? So they have started the reform in 1988. Really, that is very similar as China's rural house responsibility system at the beginning. Just everything is production is team collect production. Now give land to individual farmers to become a residual claimant and that. And then this further strengthens the security of land every 10 years. Okay? Actually, when talking here, and last year they had another law. Okay? So but our data we look at earlier. Right? Okay, so there's a study in 1993, and so beginning, I think is so there's a law allow the lease the duration for 20 years. Okay, and perennial land for 50 years. So perennial land is, but that I think quite universal. Perennial or forest land, you look at many countries, they are typically to have a longer. And then, so the law is before 2013, almost 15 years, 20 years is over. Okay, so almost only 2 years left. So people kind of feel a little bit uncertain. But many of the farmer actually that same thing happened now in China. We're talking about when it expired or what will happen later. So people can feel a little wary about that. Right? So by 2013, the government, but I think that in Vietnam's case, because every 10 years they come up with this law, people probably have some expectation. See, okay, this will happen. Okay. But we also saw some of the anticipation effect later you will see, at least especially in the sales market. Okay. So in 2013, they have this new law. So one of the main highlights is to extend from 20 to 50 years. Okay. And another important thing is some place when they have a new law, in China now they have sort of 3 rights separation. Before the law, they actually titled the entire country. Okay, but for this law, no titling is involved. Okay? Just like the assurance for another 20 to 30, 50 years. Yeah? And then, as I already explained, use difference design to evaluate. So the first difference between annual and perennial plot. And another difference is before and after the law. Yeah? So typical, we use this frame already. Number of people use this simple household model try to capture the transaction cost. So when the law is implemented, transaction cost is reduced. So the wedge, risk, and the autarky become smaller. Okay, and also we differentiate by ability. So if you're more higher, more able farmer, more likely. If you allow you to lease, you are more likely to lease. So try to capture these two features, and the rest is just maximize the profit here. Okay, so based on that first order condition, you can derive a number of hypotheses. Okay, so the first hypothesis will increase the passage of law because of reduced transaction costs will lead to a more active rental market. So the model is more captured about the rent here. For the sales market, we not have a model here for it, but it's a little more complex. We need to have dynamic other things. But we think more or less should be very similar, just a little more complex. The direction should be very similar. Right? And then also, while the law has no, we don't think it's a direct impact on the lease-in side, but because now more land is available from the lease supply side, so of course it would also make it easier to lease in, right? So expect to see that too. And then that lease in should be increasing in farmers' ability. If you're more better farmer now allowed to lease, you would lease more. Okay, and for the people should have negative relationship between lease out and ability. Right? And then also the law would also lead to a more high out of labor. Right? And then eventually we expect, because of this market is better in general and should have a better welfare. Yeah? So the data is really from the Vietnam access to resource house survey. It's panel survey. So what we use is from 2008, 2016, but now we have a few new rounds. So I know. Right? So 3 years before, okay, and 4 years after the reform, right? And so for this outcome variable on the land transfer, we have a plot land. Okay, so they collect data on multiple plots. So we know exactly which plot is leased. Which plot is leased out, but we can separate from perennial land and also annual land. Okay, so that's important. Okay, so because of the BID, okay, so the cheat is basically is what we use is for annual land. Okay, and then you collect with the time 2013. Okay, so the key coefficient, the beta 3, captures the impact of the law, okay, and then standard with time and cheat and a few other time value control variable at the house level and the unit levels. So what do we find? Okay, so before we look at the, because we all know important for the DID to work is the trend. Okay? So we look at the trend. We use here 2010 as the base. So compared to 2010, so here is all before, right? 8, 9, 8, 10, 12. Okay? So relative to 10, we're very happy with the lease. Okay, so lease out, lease in, at least there's no trend, at least. But of course, I can argue we would like to have even longer years and probably is better, but we don't have longer. But at least based on that, it's almost nothing difference, okay, between also just descriptive, descriptive data on the lease. Okay, so perennial and annual. Perennial is about 5%, 6%. Annual 7-8%. There's a paper there, so I couldn't remember exactly. But so it's not drastically different. So something people may argue they are completely different as a control may not be good if they're not moving at all, right? And then for the sales, it's very interesting. We find compared to relative 2010, 2008 is no difference, but 2012 also reduced. Okay. So, and then later you will see actually they jump up again, okay, quite high. So we saw the hypothesize is this because of the exploration of the date. So people become less secure and maybe also somehow. Oh, really? Okay, so sorry. And then we, so now if we, okay, so really for the sale and so we have some anticipation effect we have seen here, okay? And then we use event, look at the year by year, and just with, and then for, if we can accept for now, at least we see it says no change, then the effect on these out is the impact. Okay, so after the law, the annual, every year, 3.4% increase in the land rental, but more from these out, this year we do not see anything here. And then year by year, we see that is quite consistent. Okay, first year 2% gains, later 3.5% gain. Now it's more also quite interesting is now look at the solar side. Okay, so the solar actually the year before they reduced by 2%, but now you see it actually go up by 5% on average of the last later 3 years. But when you look at year by year, it's very clear now jump to 8.4%. Okay, because they have 2 or 3 years in the gap, they are not doing anything. Actually, we cut back. Right? But more promising is even after. Okay, so 2016, when the adjustment is done, we still see about 3% increase. So that is a promising side. And then we also don't see any purchase and the lease. So that we can explain why, because we would expect it, they also should increase because it generates equilibrium effect, right? But I think we thought the sample is one of the issues because for people to use the land, not necessarily only farming, but they may be the company, means other entities not captured here. Okay. So very quickly, okay, maybe give me 3 minutes and finish other outcome variable. So here I want to look at the efficiency. Okay, so first we found there is some effect on the lease out and the sale, but also want to see whether this land market induced by the law really is effective, if its efficiency enhancing. Right? And then we first estimate the production function and estimate the ability. So time look at data, we have in a few other papers also. And then we, what we did is collect, but for this efficiency is not plot level anymore. We don't have plot level production for you. That is a limitation. Okay, so we only have house level. But we interact with that ability with at least at house level. We see whether house is in and is out, whether in the right direction. Okay, and what we found here, at least over time, we found that there is the right direction. So HA is the ability value we estimate. So better farmer. Okay, so we find better farmer lease out, less lease out. Okay, and good farmer lease in more. Right? And also in the sold, although the purchase is not significant, but in the right direction. And then with combined rice and maize, we have similar finding. And then we do not see additional efficiency gain. So we just see any land rental is in the right direction. But we do not see after the law that effect even bigger. Okay. But we think maybe because of the law, as I said, is not tightening. I thought tightening should be making additional bigger effect. Maybe just reassurance may not be. Okay. So that is, and then we look at welfare. Okay, as I said, also the look at employment. Okay, we expect in part. So what we found is it's not very surprising. We see farm. So that really is the intellect of the post. Okay, so move away from farm to farm for other people. But we do not see migration with people more working in the local farm for other people. Maybe because of the land, bigger farmer, maybe company which is not captured here. Maybe they work for them because more locally. Okay, and then for the expenditure, we also find overall they have increased by 13%. given time, we have to, but it's not very lasting, although it's still 11%, but it's not significant, but less accurately estimated. Right? So, but at least on average, 13% gain in total expenditure. So that is okay. So yeah. So, since I'm the last one, so maybe get a couple minutes. Okay. So what we found is increase the tenure security is nearly the security secured by the road and lead to improve land use efficiency through promoting higher land activity. Okay. So except for activity, not additional like efficiency. Okay. So and then we see some occupation change. They also tend to shift from farm, self-farm to farm for other people. And we don't find a significant increase in migration or other things, but still there is a reallocation of their labor happening. And we also see a higher welfare. And another thing is just methodological findings is a very, very neat law to allow one type of land to be affected, but not other, which allow our researchers to study. And so one of the implications is, again, is this just change the law is relatively cost effective, okay, and but it's a big implication. Really, now everybody knows. Before I only have 20 years, now 50 years. Okay, so of course it's also we find already just. But really, the other thing is, so even when I started working with Jennifer on the Mozambique, we first found there was a land law in 1995, but 2020 still not many people know there's a law. So I think another thing is probably the implementation of law. So if this law, we also don't know how the law was implemented. If they really promoted and implemented, probably will lead a bigger effect, which we don't know. Right? Okay, so I stop here. Recommend course.
Okay, we have time for like 2 questions. Wendell,
Just a quick one. So I'm thinking about the efficiency gains. So because they might be the selling and renting out. So I think the idea is less productive farmers are renting it out and selling it to more productive farmers, and therefore you get the efficiency gain. But I don't see anyone else buying or renting.
Yeah, so that's exactly, I think, although it's positive, but not significant. So we think very hard, what is the reason? And one of the reasons, of course, we need to confirm, because based on my experience working in other countries, so also lately work, before this also did a paper in China. So we know there are many other land operators, not just farm. What we have here is a farm to farm. Okay? That's why we do not know how many leads actually going to the other. And we saw one of the things is the shift from own farm to farm for other people. Very unlikely to farm for another farm. But also, I think that is very interesting in Vietnam. I just want to know how much the land scale has increased. Because now in China, we call it as a big farm, cooperative, and many other things emerged very quickly. But I'm sure it's emerged very quickly in Vietnam too. So with that, I think we can look at have the data, more newer data. We probably can look at this issue.
I was just wondering, the identification is comparison of, say, perennial.
Yes, a perennial change and annual change.
Yeah, so considering the rental markets, I mean, both the barrels and assumption and so on, it seems okay, but just, the market for these 2 types of land and how different.
Yeah, that's what I explained before you come in there. So also the data overall, I feel whether super was representative, because I did a paper class and I did one in Oxford Political Economics, that is 2008, but again, that time is already 10%, right? But this data, Oh, the here is because plot level, okay, yeah, so it's my bad. The plot level we saw is about 80% for annual land. Okay, the perennial land, 4 to 5%. So still that's ongoing activity, it's not like zero, so you cannot compare. So there is, yeah, I think we should also look at house level, how many, okay, how much, because many other study house level, but at plot level, 6%, probably half of the level, you can aggregate it probably about 15 to 18%, I guess, okay? Yeah. So, yeah, we thought about that. But ideally, of course, you want another area, no law, and then you do it. So that would help. Yes.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts on kind of whether this supports kind of a structural transformation argument. It's clearly shifting land allocation towards more efficient farmers, but you also like you're not seeing the second step of that, which would be kind of freeing up labor to then cities. You're freeing up labor. This is freeing up labor to work still on plots in their area, right?
Yes. So actually, I'm not time to talk about limitation. So I think the future is right. So well, just assure this another bigger data is available and look more representative maybe. And also look at the longer term effect. So again, just like your people and your people is really long, but other people in like only 2-3 years. Okay? And 2-3 years it's really a little bit short, and especially with the land law. So and also I think it's more overall there's still quite a number of people under poverty and all these issues whether we can. So we have when people in Kenya work with COMDA and publish land econ, we also started want to look at poverty alleviation, but in the end we don't find any poverty, but income increased quite a bit. But we not reach to that level of reduce poverty because there is a threshold, right? But I think it's very interesting. Right? We just talked with Diane, so whether we want to look at this issue.
Let's say thanks again. It's something in all of our.